For a long time, English existed somewhere outside my life, not as something I hated, and not as something I wanted. It was simply there, in the background, belonging to a different kind of world. A world of confident people, of big opportunities, of places far away from where I was standing. My life, on the other hand, felt small and predictable. I lived in a place where days looked similar and futures were usually decided early. I didn't think of my life as unhappy. It was stable. I had a job. I had routines. I knew what tomorrow would look like. And because nothing was obviously wrong, I never questioned whether something was missing. English, in that context, felt unnecessary. It was useful for travelers, for people who dreamed bigger than I did. I told myself that I was practical, realistic, someone who knew her place when I was younger. I studied English like everyone else. I memorized vocabulary for exams. I repeated grammar rules without understanding how they lived in real conversations. Once the exams ended, English quietly disappeared from my daily life. I didn't miss it. I didn't feel limited without it. Everything important could be said in my own language, and many things didn't need to be said at all. My world was familiar. Familiar streets, familiar faces, familiar expectations. I learned how to do my work well enough. I learned how to be responsible. I learned how to avoid mistakes. What I didn't learn was how to imagine something different. Ambition felt risky. Wanting more felt childish, and English somehow symbolized that wanting. There was a belief I carried quietly that big changes were for other people, people who were braver, smarter, more confident, people who didn't hesitate as much as I did. I admired those people from a distance, but I never saw myself among them. I stayed where things were manageable, where I knew what was expected of me. English stayed far away because it represented uncertainty. Speaking it meant making mistakes out loud. It meant sounding foolish. It meant becoming visible in a way I wasn't comfortable with. And so I postponed it, not consciously, gently. I told myself there would be time later, when life felt calmer, when I felt more ready. Years passed without announcement. I became very good at maintaining my life, doing what needed to be done, meeting expectations, staying reliable. From the outside, nothing seemed missing. But inside, something subtle began to feel heavy, not painful, just limiting, as if my world had invisible walls that I had never tried to cross. I didn't feel dissatisfied enough to change. That was the problem. Everything was acceptable, comfortable, and comfort can be very convincing. It tells you that you don't need to ask difficult questions. It tells you that staying is safer than exploring. At that time, English was still just a concept, a distant skill, a language spoken by people whose lives felt more open than mine. I didn't imagine it having anything to do with my future. I didn't imagine it opening doors. I didn't even imagine there were doors to open. I believed life unfolded naturally, without effort or risk. That if something was meant for me, it would come without forcing. That belief kept me calm, but it also kept me still. I didn't know yet that waiting, when repeated too often, quietly becomes a choice. There was no dissatisfaction loud enough to wake me up. No crisis, no failure, just a quiet sense of sameness. Days blending into weeks, weeks into years. I lived inside that rhythm without questioning it. English remained far away because I hadn't yet reached the point where distance felt uncomfortable. I didn't know then that a single moment, small, ordinary, almost forgettable, would begin to change how I saw everything. That English would stop being a general idea and slowly move closer to my life, not as a language to master, but as a doorway I had never noticed before. That moment had not arrived yet, but it was closer than I thought. After that long period of quiet sameness, the change did not arrive with excitement. It arrived gently, almost unnoticed. There was no announcement, no clear sign that something important was beginning. It was simply a small shift in awareness, a subtle feeling that my life, while stable, was becoming increasingly narrow. I began to notice how rarely I stepped outside what I already knew, how often I chose familiarity without thinking, how easily I dismissed curiosity by telling myself it was unnecessary. I had grown used to a life that required little risk, and because it worked, I never questioned whether it was enough. There were moments, usually late in the evening, when I felt a quiet restlessness, not dissatisfaction, not unhappiness, just a sense that something was incomplete. I didn't know what it was, so I didn't name it. I learned how to ignore it by staying busy, by filling my time with routines that left no space for questions. English began to reappear during this time, not as a demand, but as a presence. I noticed it in small ways. A short video suggested by an algorithm, a voice telling a simple story, a sentence that stayed with me longer than expected. I didn't understand everything, and strangely, that didn't bother me as much as it once would have. At first, I listened passively. I didn't take notes. I didn't study. I just listened. Something was calming about hearing another language spoken slowly, imperfectly, without urgency. It felt different from the pressure I carried in my own life. There was no expectation to respond, no requirement to perform. I told myself this meant nothing, that it was just curiosity passing through. I didn't call it learning. I didn't call it a decision. I kept it small, private, and unimportant. That made it feel safe. But the more I listened, the more I noticed how different the pace felt. English forced me to slow down. I couldn't rush through meaning. I had to stay with uncertainty. I had to accept not understanding everything immediately. And for the first time, that felt strangely comfortable. I began to realize how rarely I allowed myself that kind of patience. In my daily life, I was always moving forward, always solving, always deciding. There was no space to pause, no permission to be unsure. English created that space without asking. This quiet exposure started to affect how I saw myself. I noticed how carefully I avoided being a beginner, how much effort I put into appearing competent, how uncomfortable I felt when I didn't know what to do or say. English brought me face to face with that discomfort, but in a gentle way. I didn't suddenly want to become fluent. I didn't set goals. I didn't imagine a future where English would change my life. I simply noticed that when I listened, something inside me softened. The constant tension eased slightly. The need to control every outcome loosened. There were days when I returned to my routines, and everything felt the same. And then there were days when the sameness felt more obvious, more noticeable, as if a quiet contrast had formed between the stillness of my life and the openness I sensed in those unfamiliar sounds. I started to wonder, not urgently, but honestly, what I had been protecting myself from all these years. Why was uncertainty so threatening? Why comfort had become my strongest argument against change? These questions didn't demand answers. They simply stayed with me. English, during this phase, wasn't teaching me words. It was teaching me tolerance for slowness, for mistakes, for not knowing. And that tolerance began to spill into other parts of my life. I paused more often. I reacted less quickly. I noticed how much energy I spent trying to maintain certainty. I didn't tell anyone about this shift. It felt too small to explain, too fragile to expose. I was afraid that if I named it, I would have to act on it. And I wasn't ready for that yet. But something had already changed. I could feel it in the way I listened, in the way I noticed silence, in the way I allowed questions to exist without rushing them away. My life was still the same on the outside, but inside, a door had opened slightly. I didn't step through it, not yet. I only stood close enough to feel the air change, and that was enough to know that something had begun. Standing near that open door, I didn't feel brave. I felt uncertain. I could sense that something was changing inside me, but I didn't yet know what it meant or where it would lead. For a long time, I stayed exactly where I was, watching that change without acting on it. And strangely, that watching was already different from how I had lived before. I began to notice how much of my life was built on avoiding discomfort. Not dramatic discomfort, but the quiet kind. The kind that comes from trying something new, from not knowing the outcome, from feeling slightly exposed. I had learned to organize my days so that very little was unexpected. That predictability had felt like stability. Now it began to feel like imitation. English became a small but steady presence in this awareness. I didn't study it seriously. I didn't set rules for myself. I simply allowed it to be there. Sometimes I listened for a few minutes. Sometimes I stopped midway. There was no pressure to continue. And because there was no pressure, I did continue. I started noticing how my relationship with English mirrored my relationship with life. When I didn't understand something, my first instinct was to turn away, to decide it wasn't for me, to assume I wasn't capable enough. But when I stayed just a little longer, understanding often came not completely, but enough. That realization felt important. It showed me that difficulty didn't mean failure. It meant unfamiliarity, and unfamiliarity didn't have to be avoided. It could be approached slowly, gently, without demands. I noticed how patient I became when listening to English. I didn't criticize myself for missing words. I didn't judge my lack of progress. I simply listened. That patience was something I rarely offered myself elsewhere. In my own life, I was strict. I expected clarity. I expected results. I expected myself to know what I was doing. English allowed me to exist without those expectations. It permitted me to be slow, to repeat, to misunderstand, to learn quietly. That permission began to feel valuable. I started to wonder what would happen if I treated other parts of my life the same way. If I didn't demand immediate certainty. If I allowed myself to explore without knowing where it would lead. That thought made me nervous, but it also felt honest. There were moments when I considered taking English more seriously, signing up for something, making a plan. Each time, fear appeared. Fear of commitment, fear of failure, fear of starting and not finishing. I didn't push through that fear. I noticed it. That was new. I didn't argue with myself. I didn't force a decision. I simply observed how quickly fear tried to protect me by keeping me still. And once I saw that pattern, it became harder to ignore. My days began to feel slightly different, not fuller, not more exciting, just more awake. I noticed when I was avoiding things. I noticed when I was choosing comfort without asking why. Awareness didn't change my life immediately, but it changed how I experienced it. English remained part of this quiet shift, not as a goal, but as a companion. It walked beside me as I learned how to stay with uncertainty a little longer than before. As I learned that not knowing was not dangerous. It was simply part of being present. I began to see that my life had not been empty. It had been tightly controlled. And control, when held too long, can drain curiosity. I hadn't lost interest in life. I had been protecting myself from it. That understanding felt both heavy and freeing. Heavy because it showed me how much I had avoided. Freeing because it meant I had choices. Choices I hadn't known I was making. I didn't rush to change everything. I didn't need to. Something more important was happening. I was learning to stay, to remain with discomfort instead of escaping it, to listen instead of deciding immediately. The door that had opened inside me was no longer just an idea. It was becoming a space I could stand in without fear. I didn't know what waited beyond it, but for the first time, I was willing to find out. And that willingness, quiet and uncertain as it was already changing me more than any plan ever had. I didn't step through that door all at once. There was no bold decision, no dramatic commitment. What changed was quieter than that. I began to live as someone who no longer needed certainty before taking a step. I allowed myself to move without knowing exactly where I was going. That shift didn't feel like courage. It felt like relief. For a long time, I had believed that clarity had to come first, that I needed a plan, a clear reason, a defined destination. But what I was learning now was different. Clarity did not appear before movement. It appeared because of the movement. Because I stayed present long enough to notice what felt alive and what felt heavy, English slowly moved closer, not as a challenge I needed to overcome, but as a space where I could practice this new way of being. I listened more. I spoke a little, even when my words felt uncertain. I accepted mistakes without turning them into judgments about myself. Each imperfect sentence reminded me that participation mattered more than precision. I stopped waiting to feel ready before beginning conversations, before reaching out, before trying something unfamiliar. I learned that readiness is not a feeling you wait for. It is a decision you make quietly, often without confidence. Fear did not disappear. It still appeared, especially in moments that mattered. But I no longer treated it as a signal to stop. I treated it as information, a sign that I was standing near something meaningful. And instead of turning away, I stayed. Staying changed everything. Conversations became deeper. Time felt slower, fuller. I noticed moments I used to rush past. I noticed how much of life happens in the space between decisions, not in the decisions themselves. I didn't become a different person. I became less guarded, less controlled, more willing to listen to others and to myself. I realized that the life I had been maintaining so carefully was not wrong. It was simply incomplete. And completeness did not come from adding more achievements. It came from allowing more presence. If you are listening to this and recognize the hesitation, the comfort, the quiet resistance to change, I want to say this gently. You are not behind. You are not failing. You may simply be standing at the edge of something unfamiliar. You don't need to rush forward. You don't need to know exactly what comes next. You only need to stay long enough to notice what is asking for your attention. English, like life, does not demand perfection. It invites participation. It asks you to speak before you feel ready, to listen before you understand everything, to remain present even when things feel unclear. I still move slowly. I still hesitate. But I no longer mistake hesitation for weakness. I see it as a moment of choice. And in those moments, I choose presence. I am no longer waiting for my life to begin. I understand now that it has been happening all along quietly, patiently waiting for me to notice. And that noticing, practiced gently, one moment at a time, has been enough. Thank you for staying with this story, for listening without rushing. And if you take one thing with you, let it be this. You don't need a dramatic change to live differently. You only need the courage to stay present where you are. That is where meaning grows.